Perhaps it would help the listener, before we begin talking about exactly what your views are, if you'd give a little bit of information about your background and how you came to establish this foundation.
Well, I was born some 70 years ago, and in between point 0 and 70, I learned a few things along the way. One of them was the trade of magic, that is prestidigitation, conjuring, whatever you wish to call it. I was a magician for many decades of my life, up until about the age of 50. At that point, I began to realize that I was accumulating another sort of expertise that enabled me to tell the difference between fraud and fact. I was being able to detect chicanery in others while I did it as entertainment. I found out that there was scams and swindles of various kinds, particularly the so-called psychics, who claim that they have all sorts of mystical divine powers whereby they can read minds or fly through the air or whatever you wish. And I was easily able to see through those fraudulent practices, and I began to lecture on the subject. Now I'm a full-time lecturer and, as you said, president of the James Randi Educational Foundation here in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. We pursue critical thinking on behalf of children. We try to get teachers and educational systems to adopt critical thinking modes, and we bring classrooms into the foundation, and we go out to visit classrooms to lecture on the subject of critical thinking about the so-called paranormal, occult, and supernatural. And I travel with a substantial prize behind me, a prize of $1 million called the Pegasus Prize, that is offered to anyone, anywhere in the world who can provide evidence of any paranormal, occult, or supernatural event under proper observing conditions. It's that simple. That goes to the astrologers, the therapeutic touch people, the acupuncturists, chiropractors, anybody who has something they say they can prove actually works, but which is on the edges of science, fringe science, if you will. I travel all over the world. I'm on my way to Costa Rica in a few days. In a couple of months, on my way to China. And let me see, where else? Well, Hungary and Germany, and a big conference in Italy later on this year. So I do get around the globe.
Now, what I'd like to do is to turn this directly to the topic today, and our topic is atheism. I assume that your experience in exposing what you call as scams and your interest in critical thinking are somehow tied up with your adherence to atheism. So perhaps you could give us a sort of snapshot view of your reasons for being an atheist, and then we can look at those arguments in more detail.
Well, my reasons for being an atheist are simple enough. I just simply don't see any compelling evidence to believe in deities of any kind, male or female or androgynous, of any culture, any race, any philosophy. I don't see that we should have to invent gods for things that we don't understand and can't presently explain. Since the concept of gods first arose, and that must have been many tens of thousands of years ago with our species, many things have become explained. We don't have a rain god any longer, at least we in this civilization as we know it don't have a rain god, because we understand quite thoroughly what causes rain. But we still have a god who promises us immortality and rewards and paradise and whatnot, things that I find untenable. I find them unacceptable. They are not necessary for my philosophy to explain the world as much as I possibly can. That doesn't mean that there aren't mysteries that sort of beleaguer all of us. We'd all like to have answers to mysteries, but to invent deities in order to explain them, I think, is juvenile.
Okay, so you say there's just no evidence. That's the foundation of your atheism. Certainly, a lot of people would say, but wait a moment, isn't there just evidence all around us? I mean, the fairly common argument is sometimes called the argument from design, that the world is very complex. It's sufficiently complex that we couldn't explain it were it not for the presence of a deity. I take it that doesn't convince you. Could you try to say why not?
Well, not at all. As I'm sitting here at my desk at the foundation, I'm looking at a poster on the wall. Special lecture introduced by Professor Richard Dawkins, Pursuing the Chimera with James Randi. That was a talk I gave a few months ago at Oxford University in England, and Richard Dawkins is a well-known writer and philosopher and scientist. He has written a book called The Blind Watchmaker, which handles that problem, if you can call it a problem, very adequately, and I heartily suggest that people who have this question on their minds obtain a copy of the book, either from the bookstore or from the library. It's called The Blind Watchmaker by Richard Dawkins, D-A-W-K-I-N-S. Highly recommended, and it can certainly handle much better than I can in the short span of time we have here the problem of design. It appears when we look at the world as if it has to have been designed by some sort of intelligence, but that isn't necessarily so. We are relying on our experience, our limited experience of the immediate world in a small time segment that we occupy during our lives in order to make that judgment. I think Dawkins outlines it very well.
Could you give, I mean, obviously we can't go into it in enormous detail, but I wonder if you could even take a minute and a half here to briefly explain to the listener why the appearance of design is not a sufficient reason to believe in a deity.
Well, because we are given almost infinite time for species to develop from very simple one-celled creatures, and we just simply can't accept or even give any value or honor to the often thrown about canard that man is supposed to have descended from apes. No, that was never claimed by the evolutionists. Never, under any circumstances. It's a canard invented by the creationists who would like to make it part of the mythology that they tell about people who believe in evolution. It is inescapable that given enough time and enough combinations and permutations of molecules and atoms in order to make molecules, that certain basic forms of life are going to develop, and that those forms of life are going to refine themselves and in most cases will be more and more sophisticated, while at the same time the vast majority of the new species, the new varieties that come along, die out because they're not viable. It's the ones that lived, the ones that survived that we see today, and they are very complex. We hear often the story about, well, how could a figure, an organ as very sensitive and complex and sophisticated as the eye ever develop by accident? It didn't develop by accident. It developed by a process called evolution, which is a series of experiments that nature plays by repetition, with billions and billions of experiments happening every second for many billions of years. It has to refine itself if there's anything to this survivability of this particular species. And of course, if there isn't, the species vanishes. All we have is the successes of billions and billions of experiments down through the years. That's all we have to show for it. But what we have to show for it is things like Sophia Loren and Arnold Schwarzenegger.
You've provided a reason, a sort of synopsis of the view of why the design argument doesn't work, and you've tried to say that the basic reason why you're an atheist is that you just don't see any evidence. Would that mean, or is it fair to say that means that you think that people who are theists are stupid or uninformed? How would you describe them? How would you explain the fact that so many people do seem to be theists?
I think uninformed, because as a good friend of mine in New York City pointed out to me just a couple of years ago in one succinct statement, I think the reason that people believe these things, by and large, is that they don't really understand how the real world works. There's a lot in that simple statement. The real world is a mechanistic world. It's electrical, it's electromagnetic in nature, it's physical in nature. It actually works. It's a large machinery, a very complex machinery made that way by the evolutionary process. And that includes the organisms that are here and the geology of the planet that we live on. I think that most people have very, very little knowledge about that sort of thing, and when they start to investigate it, they're absolutely dumbfounded. They're confused and confounded. They're overrun by the problem. If they understood a little better some of the mechanics of how the real world works, they would understand the process much better.
Okay, so part of it is simply that
they're uninformed.
They're uninformed. In fact, use the language you used earlier. You talked about there being mysteries in the world, things that we can't explain, and you acknowledge that there are such things.
Well, not that we can't explain, not that we can't explain at this moment.
Okay. And perhaps then part of your point is that even some of the explanations that are there now are not explanations that many of the people in the street would know or understand.
And they also may be explanations that are not quite correct. You look at Newton compared to Einstein. Now, Newton came up with S equals ut plus half at squared, the simple law of motion of bodies, falling bodies and whatnot, and that covers the world very nicely, as Newton knew it. But he didn't know about subatomic particles, which don't obey those laws at all, or about things as large as galaxies and quasars and black holes. They don't obey those laws either. But then when we get into relativity, which is Einstein, and quantum physics, which is a large group of people beyond Einstein, we begin to understand how these things are explained. And S equals ut plus half at squared is not wrong. It's simply buried in all the more complex theories and equations that express really how the world works. Newton wasn't wrong. He just covered a more limited aspect of the universe, a smaller part of the spectrum. So science corrects itself as it goes along. That's something that things like religion don't do. They never correct themselves. They make up dogmas. Those dogmas are established. They're axioms. They don't go anywhere beyond that. They just simply say, this is true and always will be true, and I don't want to hear any discussion about it. I think that's very closed-minded, and I think that that science really has the attitude that we should be going after, which is, show me. I want to know more.
Let me, I want to pursue this a little bit further, but let me pause for the benefit of anyone who may have tuned in late. This is Ideas and Issues. My guest this morning is James Randi, former magician and president of the James Randi Educational Foundation in Florida. And our topic today is atheism. All right, there's no way which, we've talked some about the arguments for the existence of God, why people think they might have evidence. The other way in which people often go when they describe why they are theists is they will say or talk about faith. How would you understand claims about faith? If people make them, how do you evaluate them? Well, you have any comment there?
Define your term for me.
Well, I don't know. I'm just repeating the sort of language that people use. I mean, I guess the basic idea is that the average person who uses the language will say there are mysteries in the world, there are things we can't explain, that we have to have some kind of faith either to provide that explanation, to provide meaning in life, to provide morality, whatever it might happen to be.
Well, people say that I have no faith. I have more faith than the average person, I think, but it's not the kind of faith that they have. There are only two varieties of faith, so far as I see it, blind faith and reasoned faith. I have reasoned faith in the probability, the very strong probability, that the sun will rise again tomorrow, as it always has. That is, that the earth will rotate in the direction of the sun, and the sun will appear to rise off the horizon. I know that from past experience, and I know that it's been going on for many millions of years, and I expect that it will go on for many millions more. I do that based on reason and expectation and past experience. But blind faith is, oh, I'm going to live forever. I just know it. When I die, I won't really die. I'll go someplace else. There. I don't want to think anything more about that. I've just decided that's the way it is. I've decided that's what I'm going to accept. That's blind faith, because there is no evidence for that whatsoever. The kind of faith that I have is faith based upon evidence. I have faith in my friends. I have faith in the chair that I'm sitting on. I've been sitting on this for many years now. It hasn't collapsed yet. When it does collapse, my faith will be broken in this chair, and I'll either get a new one or I'll fix it. But faith is a very useful part of our lives, of course, if it's based upon experience and upon evidence.
Now let's turn to one other sort of thing. This one may actually be straight in your ballpark. That other people, when they talk about their beliefs, will say they've had certain experiences, that they've seen God work, that prayer has been answered. As a former magician, I mean, how do you evaluate these sorts of claims? What do you have to say about them?
Let's handle their prayers have been answered. What percentage of their prayers have been answered? That's always the question that I ask, and they say, oh, always. I never have any failure that way. What do you pray for? Do you pray that you'll have enough food to put on the table tomorrow? And you do have it, but that's largely due to your own efforts, is it not? Yes, but it's possible that I might not have found the food or might not have had the money to buy the food. That's all possible, too. These people are very selective in their thinking. I know of people, for example, I was just on a major television show a couple of weeks ago where a gentleman practicing the art of Qigong from China said that he was 100% correct, that he could always broadcast healing power to people who had aches and pains or problems